For those who have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Justin Wellum. I'm one of the elders here at the church. Our main pastor, Chris, is taking a much-deserved vacation this week. So typically about once a month, a staff member or elder will come and preach the word, and you have me today. So hope that is okay with you all. If not, no option to opt out. But I also do want to take a moment to acknowledge that tomorrow is also Memorial Day, and that can be a day that's challenging for some people as well. And it is a day where we can honor different men and women who have given their lives in service for our country as well. I was doing a bit of reading about Memorial Day this week, preparing for the sermon, and there was a few things that stood out to me when I was reading about it. It's been celebrated and memorialized since 1868, and it started with a commemoration of soldiers during the Civil War. And there's a quote that stood out to me while I was reading this week that I just wanted to share with you all as you prepare for tomorrow in whatever way you want to honor and celebrate those who have given their lives to their country. And this quote was from the Memorial Day address in 1868 by President Garfield. And it says, "We do not know one promise these men made, one pledge they gave, one word they spoke, but we do know they summed up and perfected by one supreme act the highest virtues of men and citizens. For love of country, they accepted death and thus resolved all doubts and made immortal their patriotism and their virtue." So if you have loved ones who have given their life in service to our country, I just want to take a moment and personally thank you for their service and hope that tomorrow is a day that you can honor and remember them. It's also fitting that the focus of today's sermon is actually our place in our government and our national context as well. It doesn't take a lot to notice that our country is more divided and hostile than potentially any other time in human history. And today is a day where I hope you can walk out of here with a biblical framework of how we can engage as citizens in our country. And yes, part of that does mean you do have to pay your taxes to the government. It's literally in the Bible, as we will see today. So let's go ahead and open up our Bibles to Matthew 22, 15 through 22. If you're new to Fathom, we are working through the book of Matthew this summer. We've been doing this for a couple summers in a row. We're going to be in, again, Matthew 22. That is on page 827 in the black Bibles under the pew. You can open up your phone or tablet as well. And let's look and read our passage today, Matthew 22, 15 through 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the thing that are Caesar's, and to God the thing that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. Now, before we dive in about paying your taxes to the government, let's set this story in the larger context of where we've been the last few weeks. In Matthew 21, Jesus entered Jerusalem leading up to Passover. It began what we now call Passion Week, which is the final week of Jesus' life. He began by entering Jerusalem as a king, with the crowd saying, "Hosanna, Hosanna to the highest." After that, we heard a couple weeks ago from Eric about Jesus clearing the temple, which had money changers in there who were defiling that sacred place of worship. These two events, Jesus' triumphal entry and Jesus clearing the temple, caused the Pharisees and religious leaders to grow enraged at Jesus. In Matthew 21, verse 23, they publicly questioned his authority and declared boldly, "By whose authority do you do these things?" Jesus doesn't directly answer them, but instead, in typical Jesus fashion, poses a question back to them about John's baptism and where it came from. And the Pharisees, fearing the crowd, said, "We don't know." Jesus then refused to give them an answer since they weren't being forthright with him. After that episode, we see three parables in chapter 21 and chapter 22. They were the parables of the two sons, the tenants, and the wedding feast. And those are the last 3 weeks of our sermons that Chris has done. So if you've not had a chance to listen to those, please do so. They're really great. All these parables had the same main point. And this is the main point. The religious leaders are guilty of not actually following God's law. And they have rejected Jesus as the Christ and the Son of God. When I was looking at chapter 21 and 22, it made me really think about like a boxing match. This almost feels like Jesus is going against the Pharisees, and they're trading blows and punches back and forth. The Pharisees are trying to question his authority. Jesus then tells stories and parables about them, and they're going back and forth. And imagine, though, you're the Pharisees, and you just have been knocked down by Jesus again and again and again with 3 stories that essentially say your whole job that you are doing, you're doing it actually pretty terribly, and you're guilty of sin. Imagine how you would feel. You probably would be feeling a bit angry. I would probably be feeling a bit angry. And the Pharisees have had enough of Jesus. They decide they can take a more active approach to try and trap Jesus and to get rid of him. They're trying to rally when they're down in the boxing ring and trying to place Jesus in a trap to get rid of him. So we see here a shift that will impact the rest of the book, and that eventually will lead Jesus dying on the cross. And their shift becomes more aggressive, more desperate, and with a single goal of trying to get Jesus out of the picture. He's becoming too influential and too powerful. We're going to look at this specific instant in depth, but I do believe that there are some larger implications for us today. Jesus creates a model for us here of how we ought to live out in our national context as engaged citizens. The challenge is that he establishes a way to live both in the world and not of the world. The Pharisees try to trap him by taking a side and giving him an either-or choice, either Caesar or God. Jesus responds instead with a both God and Caesar. And this framework of both and is what I'm going to use today to build up my main points and how we have to live in the both and as we navigate the secular sphere within the Christian sphere. And that's why I'm calling today's sermon Both And. Let's go ahead and look back at verses 15 through 18 in our text. Again, Matthew 22, verses 15. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites?" Again, after Jesus has exposed them 3 times with his parables, the Pharisees have gone away and they've retreated to try and come up with a strategy of how to trap Jesus, this more aggressive, desperate strategy. When I was reading, I just had to slightly laugh and chuckle, though, that the Pharisees thought they could actually go and trap Jesus, the God of the universe who made the world and was the perfect man to possess all knowledge and wisdom, and they're going to come up with a game plan that's going to be perfect to trick Jesus. Well, we'll see what happens to them. Spoiler, it doesn't work. But after discussing and coming up with a solution, they decide to send a contingent of both the Pharisees and the Herodians to try and trap Jesus and to scheme against him. Now, on paper, these 2 groups didn't make any sense. The Pharisees, as we know, did not approve of Jesus and were supposed to be sympathetic to the Jews that were not in favor of the Roman Empire. The Pharisees, their job was to try and interpret God's law and to lead the people. The Herodians, on the other hand, were a group of people that were influential supporters of Herod and ultimately of Rome. On paper, these 2 groups would never have meshed. One wanted to expand Roman rule and influence and to do more punishment towards the Jews, and the other group was supposed to be the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people. But it's amazing when you have a common enemy in God, how 2 groups of people can still come together. The Pharisees wanted the Messiah to help overthrow the Romans, and the Romans wanted Jesus to not have any influence over the people. He was their common enemy and target number 1. And the irony is that Jesus decides to do neither of these things and paves his own way. What he does is he models for us our first both and statement. And that's my first key point today, which is this. Christians need to both live peacefully with others and speak up when there is injustice. This is a hard one for myself personally, and many other individuals to do well. We do see Jesus model it here. So if we go back to our text, look back at verse 16. In verse 16, they're laying on thick the flattery and praise for Jesus. You are truth. You're not swayed by people. All this flattery, but the Pharisees are not sincere in their flattery. They're buttering him up to try and get him to fall into this trap. But the irony is that despite their sarcasm, their flattery, trying to not have him fall into the trap, you actually have him speaking truth. Jesus is truth, and he does speak honestly and without the sway of public opinion. You just wonder and you wish and you pray that the Pharisees would have seen that he actually was the truth of the gospel. But it's amazing what sin can do to blind you from that. The Pharisees then are trying to bait him and to respond to hopefully get him into trouble. They then ask him in verse 17 if one should pay taxes to Caesar. Now, the tax that they're referring to here is called the tribute tax, which was a tax that was paid by all non-Roman citizens to Rome. The amount was 1 denarius, or a day's wages, and was paid by all adults, including women. This is one of the 3 types of taxes that the Jews experienced under Roman authority. They also had the temple tax, which was paid to support the upkeep of the temple. They also had indirect taxes like customs, sales taxes that we still have around today, which you might chagrin about as well. The combination of all 3 taxes were very burdensome for the Jews. It was really financially hard for them to commit and to fulfill their obligation to provide their tithes and offerings to God. And also, this tax particularly bothered them because it was paying directly to the people that they were in submission and slavery to. So imagine that you essentially are taking your money and giving it to your bully and saying, hey, here's more money to keep doing the bullying that you're doing to me. You can see where there's a lot of resentment that was built up about this tax. They didn't want to support the Roman regime, and they were wanting to prioritize their tithes offerings to God. There was lots of attempts to overthrow the Romans because of this tax, such as Judas the Galilean in 86. Lots of groups and activists, the zealots, started coming about, and the spoiler is that none of them were successful against Rome. But they had this hope that the Messiah would be the one to help overthrow the Romans and to lead revolts here. So the Pharisees, though, they feel good about this plan to trap Jesus. They brought their new colleagues, the Herodians, who are loyal to the emperor and the Roman Empire, and they think they set Jesus up. If Jesus answers, don't pay taxes to Caesar to try and appease the Jews, then the Herodians will report him and probably get Jesus arrested for treason. If he says, pay taxes to Caesar, all the Jews and the followers of Jesus will be angry because they all hate the Romans. It feels like a lose-lose situation. Yet, Jesus doesn't bow out peacefully and quietly. He calls out their wickedness and deception, says in verse 18, but Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why put me to the test, you hypocrites? The language here doesn't capture the intention of the original Greek. Malice is more closely translated beyond evil intentions. Jesus views what they are doing as an injustice and as a wrong that they are committing. He doesn't back down, but states clearly what it is, a trap to get him arrested and murdered. Jesus will respond in verse 19 with a brilliant rebuttal, but let's dig a little bit more about how we can live peacefully and also speak up when there is injustice that is happening to us and to others around us. Jesus doesn't lead a riot or promote violence or hate due to the evil that was sparked all around him. He does, however, call out exactly what he is seeing and doesn't shy away from the truth. Now, we have to be careful here in defining what we mean by injustice. There are many times that we think we are experiencing injustice, and actually we're experiencing consistency and tough love. As many of you know, as I said at the beginning, I'm a teacher and a school administrator in my day job, and if you've not been around high school students before, they are the absolute best at attempting to call out injustices that happen to them all the time. This has happened in many instances in my classroom over the years. To be honest, though, this happens just as much with the adults in my building, just to throw it out there as well, so don't pretend that kids are the problem, it's a human problem. One example of this is over the years, though, is I've witnessed students attempting to cheat on my exams and quizzes in the most hilarious ways. And I'm going to give you my top 5 in no particular order. And to kind of set the stage, I taught chemistry for a while, so most people did not like chemistry. I loved it. So there's a lot of cheating happened to help overcome that hard subject. First thing, writing on a note card different formulas and equations, and then sticking it on the inside of their belly, and trying to subtly lift their shirt up during the time to read a test what they've written. A student attempting to listen to music and then with their computer, and then having their classmate unplug their headphone jack and hearing a YouTube video of a student reading their notes out loud for the whole room to hear. Props to that student who pulled out the headphone. A student trying to put makeup on and opening their makeup bag to have a cheat sheet with a periodic table inside the bag. Student trying to eat hot Cheetos and having included an answer key in their Cheetos bag. Kind of sticky, kind of gross. And finally, students attempting to perform different sign language, gestures, code signs, different things across the room with their peers. It's amazing when people are like, this is A, this is B, this is C, this is D. They have different gestures they try and do across the room for multiple choice exams. Now with all these instances, the pattern of exposing a student happens in nearly exactly the same way. I've done it for 10 years, as it goes exactly the same way. You go often to the student either in a whisper, after class, or sometimes in a moment, and you say, hey, you are cheating. They almost always say, no, I am not. And then you say, yes, you are. You are doing blank. And then you see their panic come into mode. 9 times out of 10, they crumble under the pressure, and they say, well, so-and-so is also cheating over there. Why are you not getting on to them? This is so unjust. Now, 2 things are wrong with this strategy. 1, you just exposed yourself to cheating and admitted it. You should have just kept up the bit about not cheating and clumping yourself with someone else. So, pro tip, if you're gonna cheat, don't try and throw someone else under the bus because it makes you look bad. And second, you did throw your friend under the bus and you helped me find another student who was cheating, so thank you very much. You both have earned a 0 on that assessment. But I do wanna point out again, I've taught hundreds of high school students. Most of them are never doing this. They're doing their job, they're doing great, they're awesome. Spend more time with high school students, they're great, but sometimes they do cheat. Now, am I demonstrating injustice when I go to the one student and expose that they are not following the rules of the classroom? No, not at all. They are cheating, they have broken the rules, they need a consequence. Ideally, in a perfect world, I'm not there yet, but I think I'm getting closer, I would be able to identify all the students in my classroom and uphold a perfect standard in my classroom, but I'm not quite there yet. But it still is not unjust to issue a consequence for the student who is cheating. They were in the wrong. This is not what I mean when I say we have to stand up for injustices in our world. Injustices are also not when a parent, a boss, or a friend holds you to a high standard or expectation. Many times when we are giving direct feedback or hold the line, we can feel like that is unjust. It is not. The Bible clearly talks about injustices that we need to fight for and to actively work against. And a couple examples of these in the Bible are exploiting the weak, stealing from others, trampling on the poor, extortion, taking bribes, neglecting the oppressed, or in our text today, trying to set someone in a trap to get them in trouble or even potentially murdered as well. And let me be clear, God hates injustice. He hates those types of injustice. He calls us to seek justice. He says in Isaiah 1:17, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. We also see Jesus demonstrate a vehement disregard for injustice. He clears the temple in Matthew 21 due to their extortion that was going on and continually stands up to the Pharisees, like in our passage today, when wrongdoing is occurring. We as Christians are called to stand up for injustice and need to defend those who cannot defend themselves. But here's where that both and comes into play. We are to stand up to injustices when we see it, and we are to live peacefully with others. Oof, that's not fun. I just want to do one or the other. How do we do this? I just want to name again, this is a really hard tension to be in, like really, really hard. It's far easier to either avoid the problem completely and turn a blind eye to injustice in the world, or overcompensate and respond with unrighteous anger. To be clear, unrighteous anger, there's a place for righteous anger, violence, and hate. Both of these will show up for us in different ways and depending on the circumstance. But what are we called to, church? We are called again to live peacefully with others and stand up for injustice. But how? If we look at the slide to Romans 12, 9 through 13, this is the passage that was read over us today. And that's why I picked it for us. It says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, and practice hospitality. This gives us a roadmap and a blueprint of some ways that we can live peacefully with others and to also stand up for injustice. We are called to put others above ourselves and ground our fight for injustice in serving the Lord. If we ground fighting injustice in our own interest, in our own desires, then we will fall short of this both and. That's what the Pharisees have been doing this entire time. They are trying to promote their own selfish interests and promoting their own agenda. Church, if we lean into what Christ has for all of us and trust that he will guide us, then we will stand up for injustice and live peacefully with others. This may mean small things, such as not using social media to spread hate and slander, but instead leaning in and volunteering to support the marginalized in our community. This may mean going from publicly yelling at your boss or exposing them to having a courageous meeting with them individually. It may mean reporting to authorities worries of abuse for a friend rather than trying to handle things on your own. Church, if we are to be different than the world, then we need to act differently. We are called to maintain a spiritual fervor for the Lord and to fight for injustices that occur in our world. And we are also called to live peacefully with others. So my questions for you today is, which one do you struggle with more? Do you struggle with speaking up when something wrong is happening around you? Or do you have a hard time living peacefully? And how can you live in this both and in your day-to-day life? We can look to Jesus and how he handled this situation as a guide for us of how to do this well. Let's go back to our text and see how Jesus responds to the trap that was set by the Pharisees. Read with me again in Matthew 19, verses 19 through 21. Sorry, Matthew 22, 19 through 21. Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, therefore, render to Caesar the thing that are Caesar's, and to God the thing that are God's. Jesus asked for the coin from the Jewish leaders. It essentially states a new way of how to approach submission to authorities, which leads me to my second point today, which is Christians need to submit to God ultimately and to authority secondarily. To help us understand how profound this would have been for a first century Jew, I base a lot what I'm about to say off a commentary by D.A. Carson, who talked about the historical context that was happening here. In the first century, Jews viewed themselves in a theocratic heritage, meaning that God was the center of the rule and life of society. Even a king was seen as being divinely appointed by God and was supposed to bear the image and plan that God wanted for the country. Obviously, we know this didn't work out in the Old Testament. We have countless stories of kings in the Old Testament who did not live up to the standard. But still, the Jews operated in this theocentric form of government, where God was the ultimate ruler and responsible leader to submit to. Because of this, they viewed paying any tribute to a foreign ruler equivalent to worshiping that ruler. Jesus shows us that there's a major development of history, and Carson says it like this. Jesus does not side with the zealots or with any who expect his messiahship to bring instant political independence from Rome. The messianic company he determines to build must render to whoever Caesar who is in power whatever belongs to that Caesar, while never turning from its obligation to God. This lesson was both learned by Paul and Peter in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. And to show you where this picked up in the early church, I've put 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17 on the screen. Let's read it together. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Jesus has come to establish a new way to live. We live in the secular world, and we will all have rulers and authorities and those that we will need to respect and to submit to. However, if that's our inner circle of influence, then outside of that sphere is a sphere of God's influence, and it's all-encompassing. It's our ultimate authority. We need to primarily submit to God and his commands. Under that, though, we are called to honor our rulers and those in authority. God is sovereign and has placed them in places of power and position, and we need to trust that he is in charge and control. Yet, this doesn't mean that we submit and follow the law when it defies what God has for us. The Bible provides several examples of where men and women submitted ultimately to God, and it meant going against the rulers that were in authority at the time. Take a look at Exodus 1, 15 through 21. This is the start of the book where Israel is in captivity by Egypt, and the edict has been made that all new babies that were boys had to be killed. Listen to what happened here. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. We also see Daniel in Daniel 6 be set up by rulers in exile to be trapped because of his power and influence. Sounds like our text today. They devise a plan, the people in that area, to force everyone to pray to Darius or the ruler, or they'll be thrown in the lion's den. And immediately after the edict was made, look how Daniel responds. Take a look at Daniel 6, verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. In both of these examples, they submitted to God ultimately and to authority secondarily. And these are just a couple examples in the Bible that talk about this. And this conviction, it happens, you need it in 2 ways. It takes courage to submit to authorities in lives, and it takes courage to ultimately submit to God and go against authority when appropriate. And this is hard to swallow and to embrace in a year like 2024. We have an upcoming election in the fall. College campuses are filled with riots over the war going on in Israel and Palestine, and things are more divisive than ever. Both of these examples also model how we can do what was shared in 1 Peter 2:17. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So church, we are called to be different. We are called to embrace submission to God and to authority. So how does it show up for you in your workplace or in your sphere of influence? How does it show up for you and your families? How do we do this when we disagree with those in authority? We need to remember that we can trust God in all of this. He has ordained the rulers and authorities to be in their place in that particular moment in all of human history. It may feel like our nation, our community is falling apart, but nothing is a surprise to God. He is sovereign today. He has been sovereign in the past, and he'll be sovereign in the future. If you're having a hard time with submission or believing this, I encourage you to take that to God and trust that he is the God of all control. And this leads me to my final point today, which is this. Christians can both fully trust God and be an influence in the world. Let's finish this passage and read verse 22 together. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. Jesus has not only silenced them, but they were completely marveled by his response. It was wise, honest, truthful, and straight to the point. It left an impression on those around him, and it built credibility and trust with them. Jesus' response also asks us to probe a little bit deeper and to ask beyond whether we pay our taxes, but to ask us actually more importantly, what do we owe Caesar and the government, and what do we owe to God? This is not an owe, like we need to do something to please God and to earn our salvation, but it's a reality that we do accept God's grace to us and we do owe him our very lives. R.C. Sproul says it well like this. We see that Caesar's face was on the denarius, but whose image is on us? Whose image do we bear? Whose image is stamped on our souls? We, as Christians, are image bearers of God. We belong to him and do not owe him just our tithe, but our lives. We are called to live and go into the world bearing the image of God and bearing his name in every area of life. We are called to use the gifts and talents that he has given us to make this world better. God is ultimately in charge and doesn't need us to redeem the world, but he allows us to partner with him to bring beauty to the broken and cultivate and create growth in areas that are desperate for redemption. Tim Keller in his book, Every Good Endeavor, says this: work is not primarily a thing one does to live, but the thing one lives to do. It is, or it should be, the full expression of the worker's faculties, the medium in which he offers himself to God. Work can mean our jobs as business people, engineers, teachers, stay-at-home parents, custodial workers, or preachers. It can also be the area that we use our talents and gifts to honor God and to bring beauty to the world. We are called to go and redeem. Now, how do we know how God is calling us to cultivate and to make this world better? A majority of my current job, like I mentioned, is actually helping develop curriculum and resources to help our high school counselors advise students on conversations that will help them shape the future that they have. And I love my job. And I truly believe that I am now using my gifts and abilities to train and coach school leaders to help have life-changing conversations with students. But I didn't think I would end up in this role 10 years ago or 15 years ago. When I was growing up, I was convinced I was going to spend the majority of my life overseas working as a medical missionary. I wanted to work for a mission organization providing medical care to underserved communities. That was my goal ever since I was a kid. And I did all of the right things to be accepted to medical school. I volunteered. I got good grades. I prepared for my exams. I did shadowing opportunities. I networked correctly. I did everything that I was told to do. But God put a major roadblock to prevent me from going down that path to becoming a doctor. And I fought against it. I refused to listen to him for years and years and years. And I kept following that path and wouldn't let myself trust God that I could serve him in another way. How gracious God was during that season, and also how foolish I was at that time. It's often like that, isn't it? In his loving mercy, I was able to teach chemistry right after I graduated college to a group of students in Phoenix, and I fell in love with education and teaching. And I felt like my passions and talents aligned with God's call for the very first time. Now I'm wrapping up 10 years in education, and now know that God has called me to serve in the role that I am now in. And for those who just finished the school year, congratulations, you made it. If you have a week left, you're almost there. Just gotta give my shout out there. It could change my passions or my desires or my plan, but I trust that God has placed me in the field that I am in right now to cultivate the area and the places that I'm in. In church, we need each and every one of you here today to go into this crazy world and do your work well. We need plumbers, lawyers, teachers, HR representatives, police officers, politicians, engineers. We need stay-at-home moms and dads, childcare workers, artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs. We need you to be faithful to where God is calling you and to do it to the absolute best of your ability. We want people to be marveled at your work, just like the Pharisees were. We need to do our work well where we can build trust, credibility, and demonstrate our competence, because when we do that, we honor God with the gifts that he has given us, and it allows us to really demonstrate to the world that we are serving a bigger purpose than you or I. One final quote from Keller to summarize this point. We are not to choose jobs and conduct our work to fulfill ourselves and accrue power. For being called by God to do something is empowering enough. We are to see work as a way of service to God and our neighbor. And so we should both choose and conduct our work in accordance with that purpose. And you thought we were just gonna be talking about taxes today. So church, where does this leave us? Let's close out with a few points of application and questions for you to think about this week. First, do you need to practice living peacefully with others or standing up for injustice? This world is broken and needs each of us, and we are called to hate what is evil and to cling to what is good. How can you ask God to break your heart for what breaks his? How can you also ask God to show up for the oppressed in the way that Christ would do it? Think about your week ahead and how you can live that reality this week. Next, what do you need to do to live in the reality of submission to authority while also ultimately submitting to God? How will you trust that God is in ultimate control even when things feel out of control? And finally, how can you approach your week in whatever sphere that you are in with the goal of trying to bring beauty and bettering that sphere? Whether that's changing diapers, closing business deals, writing reports, providing medical care, or teaching lessons, how can you believe that you are slowly fighting against the brokenness in this world? Collectively, if we all were to live as engaged citizens and embrace the both and, then I know that we would see the huge impacts in our churches, communities, and world. We have the God of history on our side and can live confidently despite the uncertainty that this week, month, or year is one that he has for us. And to be clear, you still do have to pay your taxes. Let's pray. Dear Father, we have a big call in front of us, Lord. We need to live in this both and of how we navigate our relationship with you and submit to you ultimately, and what that means for us in our every single day life, whether that's going to work, taking care of kids, or taking care of loved ones, or just really trying to find that purpose, Lord. And I pray today that whatever you have for us, that you are the ultimate authority that we need to put our relations to. That the image that is stamped on each of us is the image of you, that you are the one that we bear to wherever we go. And I pray that as we have moments where we can struggle with uncertainty or not sure of the direction things are going, I pray that we bring that to you and trust you today, Lord, that we put all of that at your feet, and that we know that you are the one who has the plan and the story that is for each and every one of us, and you know things deeper than we can ever know that, Lord. So as we reflect, Lord, I pray that this will be a time where we can really close out our time today and to really reflect of what you are calling to each of us to as we live out our week. In Jesus' name, amen.